Hello, friends. Happy Sunday. I am running a few minutes behind, and so I'm just going to take a moment to get centered. For any of you who have tuned into the Knowing podcast, I've done two different solo episodes, episode 14 at the conclusion of season 1 and episode 1 at the beginning of season 2. And with both of these, I actually talk a little bit about my practice of vertical alignment and how this practice is something that really roots and grounds me every single day. And it really is the time that I take that really just kind of orients my compass, so to say. So a couple of years ago, I just had this revelation. I call them little revelations because I'll be just doing something, going about my day, and then all of a sudden something comes to me. And with this little revelation, I just had this visual in my mind of being vertical, almost like a lightning rod that's deeply rooted into the ground, going all the way up to the sky. And when the lightning strikes, it just, the force of the lightning together with the, I guess you could even just say prowess of the rod itself, it goes straight into the ground and deep, and it just so powerful and potent. That's vertical alignment in one sense, to kind of liken to some kind of visual example. And in vertical alignment, our compass is pointed north. We're oriented in the right direction. We're moving in the right manner, in the right mode, in the right aspects of life, rather than looking to the horizontal plane, having our compass magnetized east and west. And so this whole concept is something that has really, I've really kind of burrowed deep into my life by every morning dedicating 60 to 90 minutes to get vertically aligned. And so this time usually looks like prayer, meditation, journaling, actually asking myself some pretty deep questions. There's an acronym that I created that actually I'm excited to introduce more so in the next couple of weeks. I'm developing 14 days of vertical alignments because for the Knowing retreats, which I started last year, these retreats are effectively what I liken to the boot camp of the soul. And for each attendee, every morning I would give them a vertical alignment, which was effectively awakening their body and just kind of like coming awake and listening and tuning into what does my body have to tell me? Is there something going on? Because for so much of my life, I have lived disassociated from my physical body. And actually, there's been a lot of shame around it, given how it was raised and kind of the Christian conservative environment, which had a lot of shame around the body. And so I lived very much so disconnected. So the first practice in vertical alignment is to really actually listen to, is there any sensations in my body that might have to tell me something? And even just kind of honoring it. Like there's something, as I've really kind of come to recognize and honor this physical self, I have come to actually like just do skin to skin and just like kind of like, if I'm feeling overwhelmed even, I'm just kind of like put my hands on the back nape of my neck. That's the thing with going live. You can't edit these things out. So funny. And honestly, y'all, I'll just put a hand on my chest sometimes. And it's that physical contact that it's what our mothers would do to us when we were babies. The physical skin to skin contact. It's really no different today as adults. We still need that nurture and care. And the question is just who's giving it. And what's really powerful is when we're able to self-soothe and care for ourselves in a way that we once looked external for, but now we can actually care and comfort our own selves. And so in me kind of getting more so connected with my body, I think it's going to be more work that I need to do in order to do this. And I'll just give one more example about this. So I was reading a book by Peter Levine about trauma, and he has 12 exercises. And I actually started with number 1 and then stopped because I was like, this is so powerful. I actually need to really dedicate time and space for it. So actually the week of my birthday, I'm creating a whole little itinerary for myself, and I'm going to really honor that week. I use my birthday week as a time to plan for the next year and really vision and forecast against my ideal of who do I want to be at the end of my life. But this year specifically, I'll be turning 32. How do I want my life to look at the end of 32? What do I want to have accomplished? And so in addition to that, I am also taking some time to really honor other areas that I do want to grow in. And this is one of those, is taking those 12. It's actually a CD that he has. So I need to get a CD player and run through just the audible working through those 12 steps. And I'm so excited to share with you guys what I experienced. But the very first exercise that Peter Levine had us do was like, take your finger or your wrist and just like tap it. And he was like, just tap it and really like look at it. And y'all, I did that. And I just started to cry because I think I might have been tapping like my finger, the back of my hand or something. And I was just like, wow, like I never look at my hands. I never look at, and actually when I have looked at my hands my entire life, I always hated them. I just thought that they were kind of already wrinkled at what, like 12 years old. And I was like, I did so many dishes when I was a kid and my hands are wrinkly. But it was just so interesting. I was so disconnected from my body, my physical body, that I never took the time to literally look at it. And so as he was having us just tap on like your wrist, I'm looking down because I'm tapping. And man, it was really powerful for me. That so powerful to the extent that I stopped what I was doing and was like, let me really set aside time for this. So talking about the physical body and awakening it. That's kind of the first practice of vertical alignment. And so after I go through Peter Levine's exercises, I may very well incorporate some of his practices into my own with vertical alignment, because that whole process of awakening our physical self, awakening the intellect, awakening the emotions, awakening the spirit at the beginning of the day ensures that every single facet of who we are comes into alignment so that all of our intelligences are activated. And for those of you who attended, I think it was 2 weeks ago, I actually read an excerpt from my book. So 2 Sundays before, I read an excerpt from my book where I was describing the self, the soul, and the spirit, and kind of what each one means. And when I say it, what do I mean by that? I am by no means a stoic or a great philosopher. And frankly, there's a lot of which when I was writing Knowing, I actually did not proceed with reading a lot of these books because I wanted to learn it for myself. And even from myself, I really believe that intuition, the Latin root of it is intuere, and that means to be led from within. And this whole concept of being led from within, taught from within, I believe that there are truths, universal truths, not necessarily tied to a specific religion, yet taught by most religions, that each one of us inherently knows, so long as we take the time to sit and listen. And this time of vertical alignment is that time where I sit and listen, where I really allow myself to shut out the external world and to really go inward to listen and to learn. And y'all, every morning that I do this, there is some new little revelation. That's why I say revelation, because it is kind of almost like a dawning, a coming upon, where I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that. And it's so vibrant, this whole time in the morning for me. And so I awaken my body. I set aside time to listen. I listen to my emotions. I listen to my physical self as well as my mind. Are there thoughts that need to actually be attended to in order to then put them away and allow the integrity and the purity of who I am to come forth, because so our thoughts so many times are tied to ego, which is not us. And a lot of times the thoughts are laced in fear for the future, regret over the past, guilt of the past, and rarely are our thoughts truly present here and now. And that's something that actually I've never really put into words before. But isn't that the truth, that what we're thinking often has to do with the past or the future and not here in the moment? I just started reading David Hawkins' Letting Go last night, and man, is it good. Yesterday's conversation, for those of you who tuned in, I discussed the space that Viktor Frankl discusses between stimulus and response. And he calls that space choice. And I added to it which is that before choice is belief. So effectively, if I were to amend the great Viktor Frankl, I hope he'll forgive me, and I wonder if he would agree, between stimulus and choice is belief, between stimulus and response is choice. So between stimulus and response, my new addition would be between stimulus and response is belief and choice. And then from that place of our belief systems, we then live the rest of our lives. And so this time of vertical alignment is actually to go inward and consider our beliefs and our choices and who we fundamentally are, so that our responses, according to the stimuli throughout the day, are always in alignment with who we say that we want to be. And so today, Sundays, I really do dedicate to spiritual intelligence and to going inward. And what is this third intelligence that is a part of who we are, that just is so often not discussed and overlooked, and not even really, I honestly had never heard of it before. And as I was writing, knowing, that was one of those examples of a revelation where I was like, oh my gosh, we have this intelligence. Like, there is an ability for us to understand new information by way of this kind of third channel, this third intelligence. And so when we're talking about the intellectual quotients, the intellectual intelligence, that really is coming from a few different areas. It's coming from our physical self, our mind, and it's really derived so often off of data which we've experienced or data which we've read. And thus we form a feeling and a thought about that piece of data that has been given to us or that we've experienced. The emotional intelligence, the emotional quotient, is really derived from the soul. And that is coming from our emotions and really understanding. Actually, the definition of emotional intelligence, which I just love, is the ability to understand, express, and convey one's own emotions. And then the ability to handle interpersonal relationships judiciously and empathetically. So with wisdom and with empathy. And so really this whole concept of emotional intelligence first is always predicated in our own radical responsibility to go inward and understand what is going on. I think of the soul as this cavern, this cavernous, vast space for us to go and explore. And in so doing, a lot of times we actually have to, climb down into the cavern. We have to have our tools. We have to know how to excavate this cavern. We also have to be able to remove the dross and the grime that's clinging so tightly to the edges of the cavern that's maybe even obstructing our ability to see that which is there. And a lot of times I actually, in the book, in Knowing, I've referenced a wall that effectively blocks off our access to this cavern itself. And if we were to understand the wall, each brick within the wall comprises an unprocessed memory and emotion. And so each one of these bricks becomes frozen on our wall that protects us, right? It's our parts are trying to protect us from ever getting hurt again. And so a wall is built based on all these hurtful experiences that we have never done the work to go back and process and truly understand and heal from, in order to thus have it simply be a part of our intelligence that informs our true self to then make the right decision according to all of the data that it has access to. But if we've got a brick wall there, we fundamentally don't have access to the emotional data that our intelligence wants to give us, because we're not even intelligent about the emotion to begin with. Therefore, we have no data to derive from it. So this brick wall that we have in place in attempt to protect us is actually the very thing preventing us from the ability to see the truth. And so we have to do the work to dismantle these bricks, not carelessly, because we want to protect the cavern of the soul, but we need to do the work to understand. And that's what, that first half of emotional intelligence really begins with, an understanding. Why is this brick here? What does it have to tell me? What does it have to show me? If a brick was developed at 7 years old, that brick developed most likely because there was no one else to protect that little child. And so now us as the caretakers, It is our responsibility that as we go inward, as we go in to explore the brick and then eventually explore the cavern of our soul, we do so with just so much tenderness and so much compassion, because each one of those bricks that are trying to protect us are there for a good reason. So judgment effectively cannot be in existence. And I'm talking about judgment, the judgment that is corroded by shame. I'm talking about that kind of judgment, not the judgment that comes from, judicious is the word that is the second part of the definition of emotional intelligence. I'm not talking about doing away with that type of judgment, which is sound judgment, critical thinking, etc. It's the judgment that is laced and corroded with shame, that fundamentally accuses us and makes us small and weak. It's the judgment that makes us small rather than the judgment that empowers us. And I think that's a really, really important distinction, because just completely doing away with judgment actually is very dangerous, because in one sense we completely lose this critical thinking aspect of who we are. And y'all, I think we see that. I've been seeing that a lot, both externally but also internally. When I was previously married, my husband was going through this whole metamorphosis of how, he was just killing everything with fire in his life, doing away with God, doing away with everything, and then eventually doing away with me that had ties to his past. And in this process, there was, he really was emphasizing how we just can't judge anybody. And I think, again, there's a difference. There's a massive difference between looking at someone or looking at ourselves through this lens of judgment corroded by shame and accusation, and just assuming the worst and putting a presumption on them and presuming why they're behaving or why we're behaving without us actually getting to the root of it, versus the judicious type of judgment that is actually laced with wisdom in and of itself, that helps us be able to know right from wrong, truth from lie, etc. It's the type of judgment that's in a courtroom, where it's as unbiased by feeling and emotion as possible. And so that's the type of judgment that we really need to hold on tightly to, because otherwise we're going to live in this world blind. And so today, as we're talking about just these intelligences, we just talked about the intellectual quotient, we talked about the emotional quotient, and now, we're really dedicating today to talking about the spiritual quotient, spiritual intelligence. And spiritual intelligence, man, I grew up rooted and laced in all things spirit, but it wasn't necessarily with intelligence in mind. It was more so how the shoulds and supposed tos rather than can and get tos. So one was very, very enslaving, and one was very liberating. The shoulds and supposed tos are the things that keep us in our boxes, led by dogma, and then the we get to and we can is ultimately what lends to freedom. And y'all, it's not just freedom through spiritual intelligence. There's so much freedom when all three of these intelligences are activated together. I just had this moment when I was on a plane traveling a couple years ago. It was really my first real trip after the papers were signed. And man, I was so devastated. And I also, for the very first time in my life, I sat on the plane and I just looked out the window. And I think I was flying over California or flying from California or something to do with California. And I was like, what is this feeling? And I was just like, I've never felt this way before. And I realized that I felt really happy. And I realized in that moment that I was feeling emotionally free. I didn't have anyone to take care of anymore. Here's the thing. No one can put us in emotional bondage. They can ask for it, they can threaten, but no one can emotionally capture us apart from our own acquiescence. And Viktor Frankl, speaking of him again, he would know better than anyone. He was in Auschwitz, the Nazi German concentration camps, and he readily admitted that they could put him in chains, they could take everything, they could take his life, but they could not take his soul. And y'all, that is freedom. They cannot take what's inside. Though the world may fall and crumble around us, no one can take what's inside of us. And that is true freedom. That is true freedom. And that is why when we look at, some people in third world countries, they're happier than we are in first world countries. And we're miserable over here, constantly wanting more or constantly dissatisfied, constantly unhappy. And the same can be true vice versa, right? There can be people in very affluent homes that just are deeply content and deeply satisfied. Y'all, it doesn't matter our physical external surroundings to the point that we will always have the freedom to choose, the freedom to determine what we believe and how our choice then is going to impact our response. We can't control the stimuli, but we can control the belief, the choice, and the response thereafter. And so this is why it is so incredibly important that we do this work of getting aligned every single day, to take the time to question, what are my core beliefs driving my choices, driving my responses? Because apart from deep analysis of our beliefs, we're never going to be able to hope to live in alignment with the future ideal that we espouse, we want. We have to analyze our core beliefs. And so the other day I was talking about different life focus areas. And so I really, given that we're focusing on spiritual intelligence today, I would really encourage each one of us to deeply and closely examine, what do we want? What is our ideal in a spiritual regard? What do we want our life to look like when it comes to spirit? And I'm going to do what I did the other week. I'm actually going to read what I wrote about spirit. Actually, I'm going to read all three, the definitions of all three, for those of you who did not join 2 weeks ago. I'm going to go ahead and read this, because the definitions are just so important. We're not going to be operating from the same place if we haven't taken the time to understand where each one of us are starting from. So with this, I'm just looking in my book for this. All right, defining terms. And y'all, Jordan Peterson did this in his debate with Sam Harris, which I just absolutely loved. They would come back on day 2 of the debate. They would come back and restate the other's argument to the point that the other said, yes, you understand me. We have to understand each other, because until we have a mutual understanding and we can determine, okay, this is where we're starting, that's when the gunshot fires, and then that's when we can grow. And so it's incredibly important when we're looking at terms with our partner, especially, we have to define them. At the Knowing Retreat a few months ago in Vegas, I asked everyone, I was like, what is your definition of love? We had 2 or 3 couples there, and couple A, or partner A versus partner B within one couple, they actually had pretty different definitions of love. And I experienced this in my own marriage. My former husband said, I love you. Love is sacrifice. Well, that's not that's maybe a piece of love for me, but it wasn't the type of sacrifice that causes sorrow. It was the type of sacrifice that would be like, I'm so happy to do this because I love you. So, you know what I mean? Like, there's a very fundamental difference there. So my former husband and I were operating at odds at a very critical level throughout the majority of our marriage, because we had completely different terms when we were speaking and trying to figure each other out. It's like, what is going on? So like, I was talking about commitment, asking him to be committed to me in our marriage, but I don't even know if we had that definition right. Looking back, I know very clearly that we had different definitions of love, but I bet we had different definitions of commitment. And y'all, these terms that we would just assume are incredibly easy to understand, we all have not just a different definition, but we have memories and emotions associated with these words. And sometimes these words are actually, they can be really painful depending on what our experience is. So it's so important that we define these terms. And I'm going to go ahead and start just by moving through the soul, the self, and the spirit. The soul. I have no intention of posturing as philosopher. Like Thomas More, I concede that any attempt to confine the soul to mere words is virtually impossible. Yet his honorable attempts position the soul as the seat of one's emotions. Within the soul, we experience the heights and depths of feelings, joy, sorrow, desire, ache, and awe. Through the soul, we heal and remember. We experience release and find respite from wounds long buried beneath our survival skills, carefully constructed throughout childhood. The soul is, in many ways, our emotional home. When alive and attuned, it illuminates brightly what science often calls our right brain, and what I have come to know as a third essence of our being. The degree to which we are acquainted with this home often mirrors the degree of our emotional intelligence. I'm going to read that one more time. The degree to which we are acquainted with this emotional home often mirrors the degree of our emotional intelligence. The soul is the core. It is the emotional center of our being, the place where memory, desire, intuition, and truth lives. It holds both pain and longing. The soul is where knowing begins. The self is the interpersonal expression of our being, the unique outward expression or manifestation of our inherent nature. It is how we move through the world, how we are perceived, and how we make logical sense of what we experience. We see the most authentic self in childhood, unfiltered, untamed, unadulterated, unburdened. It runs barefoot through the neighborhood. It laughs without checking for approval. It skins its knees and cries out, reaching for comfort. It is the purest expression of personality, temperament, and spirit before the world begins to shape it through pain, pressure, and performance. The self does not remain untouched for long before we consciously realize it. Familial expectations and societal messaging arrive, telling this child how they should act or feel in order to belong. For their deepest needs to be met, connection, they are given a box with their name scrawled on it and then coaxed inside. There they must exist in order to fit in. Slowly, the purity of nature becomes shaped by nurture, and the self begins to split between expression and expectation. The self is the outward expression. It is the outward layer of our humanity and our personality, body, thoughts, preferences, coping strategies, and survival mechanisms. It's the part of you and me that interacts with the world. This precious self connects the inner soul to the horizontal external world around us. The spirit, and this is our main subject for the day. The spirit is our supernatural pathway to the divine. It is part of us that reaches beyond what can be reasoned or touched. Only through the spirit can something otherworldly be pursued and perhaps understood, albeit forever limited by human cognition. Through the spirit, we experience hope that transcends pain, truth that transcends logic, peace that transcends understanding. The spirit is the upward connection. It is our divine tether, the vertical line through which we commune with God and receive insight and remember that we are whole even when we feel otherwise. Even when the horizontal expectations of the external world have seemed to forever dampen the natural expression of our innate being, the spirit directs our gaze upward and vertical to remember who we were created to be in the first place. Spirit is your eternal knowing, the thread of you and me that is and always has been aligned with love. The self, soul, and spirit are equally essential to living life to the fullest. The self celebrates its distinct essence, the soul ushers healing, and the spirit breathes hope. Apart from knowing self, we are mere shadows, disconnected from our nature and core being. Without the soul, the self is shallow and centered solely inward, lacking depth and feeling and passion. Without the spirit, the soul remains in turmoil, nihilistic even, lacking the wherewithal to transcend the physical dimension and dream and hope for a better one day. No one else is you, the sum of yourself, soul, and spirit. And y'all, as I'm reading, I'm just remembering, I'm thinking about Viktor Frankl and his book, Man's Search for Meaning. I need to read that again. I've been talking about it so much over the last couple of months. Y'all, if he had been moving through the Nazi German concentration camp, I don't think he would have survived if he had solely been engaging his intellect or solely engaging his soul or just the two of them together. He needed spirit. And I want to read this quote from his book that just is so incredibly powerful. This is on the heels of recognizing that he lost his wife. A thought transfixed me. For the first time in my life, I saw the truth as it is set into song by so many, proclaimed as the final wisdom by so many thinkers. The truth that love is the ultimate and highest goal to which a man can aspire. Then I grasped the meaning of the greatest secret that human poetry and human thought and belief have to impart. The salvation of humans is through love and in love. I understood how a man who has nothing left in the world still may know bliss. It is only for the brief moment in the contemplation of his beloved. In a position of utter desolation, when a man cannot express himself in positive action, when his only achievement may consist in enduring his suffering in the right way, an honorable way, in such a position man can, through loving contemplation of the image he carries of his beloved, achieve fulfillment. For the first time in my life, I was able to understand the meaning of the words, "The angels are lost in perpetual contemplation of an infinite glory." Y'all, this is one of the most powerful things I've ever read. I don't know about you. I close my eyes and I envision him. It's gray with the smell of dead bodies. And he is able to access love. Y'all, that is the power of vertical alignment. That is the power of the self, soul, and spirit all activated and in alignment. That is the effect and outcome and the response when all of our intelligences are activated. And each one brings data for our true self, who we were created to be. That's the person, that's the self who makes the final decision, the final naysayer about how to respond, because sometimes one intelligence is going to be louder than the other. But our job, a radical responsibility, is to tap into all three intelligences, have them come almost like to the boardroom, share their feedback, what they know, and then we get to decide. So when we think about the logical and intellectual intelligence data that it derives, and then the emotional intelligence data that it derives, the spiritual intelligence, intuition, that led from within, that really is what the spirit has access to. It's that quiet voice, whether it's our own voice or the voice of God, because there is, I believe, a remarkable difference between the two. I believe that they're both distinct and that they both have something to say. And it's not always going to be that we're hearing something from the divine, but there is always going to be a still, quiet voice. And it's our job to be able to learn the distinction between the two. And if we don't know the distinction between the two, it is going to be confusing at times to know which data source this is coming from. In business, for those of you who do marketing especially, but just in business in general, we talk a lot about attribution and having correct source attribution. So we need to know the difference between these intelligences and their sources from which they're deriving their data in order to be able to then attribute proper weight. I forget who said this, but trauma and intuition sound very similar sometimes. And so it's really important that we come to actually understand and learn from those traumatic experiences that we've had, so that we're not blindly being led into a dangerous place because we're actually having a trauma response where we think it's our intuition telling us something that we should do. So I'll go ahead and wrap up here. Thank you, friends, for tuning in. Thank you for giving me the space to just contemplate. This contemplation is so important. And y'all, I think it's so important that each one of us creates the space and time to do this, whether it's with others, whether it's on paper, whether it's with our own selves. So have a wonderful